went onto Reddit and I wanted to see what are women talking about right now when it comes to female health. A young woman shared her experience of getting an IUD and she talked openly about the pain and the bleeding. My other intern friend pulled me aside at my lunch break and she said that I should not share anything to do with women's health or periods with men. That is uncomfortable for them and for me.
The only way that we change that narrative is by normalizing those conversations between men and women.
I think we reduce our menstrual cycles to pure fertility, but it's impacting so much more than that. You're sitting here as a qualified medical doctor, also a nutritionist, but also somebody who now has had a deep focus on women's health.
A really interesting study on PMS, premenstrual syndrome, and they did just single therapy with the person that was experiencing PMS, and then they did couples therapy in another arm of the study with the partner of the person who was experiencing PMS. And they found that actually couples therapy was more effective at reducing symptoms.
But what do you think about training during your menstrual cycle?
There was an interesting study done on female footballers, and they perceived that they performed worse during their period. But actually, when they did objective measures of how they performed, their reaction times and other measures were better. So they actually performed better during that time. It's really about becoming more aware about how your hormones impact you, and that includes fertility as well.
I went through egg freezing last year, and it was really hard because I came out of a very big relationship that was quite traumatizing. And I remember all I had in my brain was, I have to do this, but the pressure of it was so much. I have to say, when I finished the last injections and had the egg retrieval, that's when I felt low.
Yeah.
It was the dip afterwards.
I was the same. No one prepares you for that.
What's the one thing that you want people to leave today's conversation with? If you're a regular listener to the show, or Live Well Be Well, or this is your first episode you're listening to, I really want to ask just a very small, quick favour. If you could please hit the subscribe button or leave a review, this helps the show more than you can imagine. It means the world to help growing this show. And you all know that I have a huge thing to want to hit 100,000 on YouTube this year. And I can't do that without your support. I really aim to bring you the best guests possible out there. And I pride myself in doing that for the show because it's so important. But to keep the guests coming, to get them to be bigger and to bring more helpful information to your ears and your eyes, I really would love to ask you to subscribe to the show. Thank you. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
On your fourth book, which is called Not Just a Period. It's such a great title.
Thank you.
And I kind of want to start, I want to start with more of a curious question, because I think we reduce our menstrual cycles to pure fertility, but it's impacting so much more than that. So I wanted to ask you, and I think so many women listening to this, which is, what do you wish that more women understood about what's really happening in their body, especially during their menstrual cycle?
It's a really great question. And it's one of the reasons why I call the book Not Just a Period, because when we think about menstrual cycles, we just think about the bleeding phase, the period, when so much more happens across that 23 or so other days outside of the bleeding phase, menstruation. And every single day is different in terms of a hormonal profile. So that means that it's impacting us in a different way every day, which is something so unique to females. It doesn't, men don't experience that. And I think the hormonal fluctuations like estrogen and progesterone that occur across the menstrual cycle, oftentimes we think about them from a fertility perspective or ovulation, but those hormones impact everything, every single part of our body, every single organ system, from our brain, our gut, our mood, how we sleep, our cravings, our metabolism, how our gut functions. And having that knowledge, I think, is so incredibly important for women because it's really empowering. It helps us feel less in dark about our bodies. And if we are struggling with any of those things, be that sleep or breakouts or cravings, we can be proactive when we really fully understand our hormones and our cycle.
When was that moment? I guess because it's interesting. I think it's so fascinating. You're sitting here as a qualified medical doctor, also a nutritionist, but also somebody who now has had a deep focus on women's health. And, I've spoken a lot on here about women's health, and we've had so many varying conversations when it comes to it. And I've learned a lot. And it's interesting that, for you've shifted your focus into this being a woman. So you kind of had that lived experience and then you're learning it along the way. What's been one of the most interesting things that you've learned personally during this journey about hormonal and female health?
It's been fascinating, to be honest. I feel like writing the book made me learn so much more about my body and feel maybe really validated about what I was experiencing. So I guess my real interest in women's health stemmed from my own experience, and that's often the case when people go through their own journey. I was diagnosed with PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, in 2018, but I was having symptoms for 2 years, and I was back and forth to the doctor whilst working as a doctor myself at the time, and I had an inkling that this is what was happening to me. But you need blood tests and an ultrasound to be diagnosed. Well, technically you could be diagnosed without the ultrasound, but in this situation, my GP wasn't convinced that I had PCOS. He felt like I didn't fit the PCOS picture, is what he called it. And so having to really push and advocate for myself and then finally get that diagnosis made me realize kind of the state of women's health within the UK and across the world, and just how we approach menstrual health is often that, you know, it's just part and parcel of being a woman. Periods are supposed to be irregular, periods are supposed to be heavy, PMS, everyone gets it. Like all of these assumptions that we have, when what I was experiencing wasn't normal, what lots of women are experiencing aren't normal. But while they're common, they're not normal and they are fixable. And so that was kind of my entry into really wanting to understand why we're not really taking women seriously in that space. And I guess like through my own research, when I got my diagnosis, I was doing my master's in nutrition. So I set out to like figure out what can I do from a nutrition standpoint and supplement standpoint, because I was simply told just cut carbs and come back when you're going to get pregnant. And that is just such useless advice. But you would I would say every second client that I see in my practice will say, I was told the same thing. It's like almost as if there's this script that everyone's given the same script, or the alternative is lose weight, which is something that women are often told. And so I just don't think that's good enough. But there were no books that you could read. Yes, you can dive into research if you're skilled to do that, if you've got access to that, but not everyone does. And I think realizing how transformative it was for me to really understand my hormones and my cycle, because a lot of this stuff isn't taught at medical school. Yes, we learn about women's health in general, menstrual health disorders, obstetrics, gynecology. But what about the women which there are 1.9 billion of us, who are having a cycle and experiencing that every day? And maybe they don't have endometriosis or PCOS, but they have really debilitating PMS, or they get really bad, uncomfortable bloating or cramps during their cycle. And they're not given the tools to help support themselves. So that was the why really behind the book, because there was such a gap in knowledge and research there.
There is a gap. And I think what's really interesting is that I'm so deep in this, Sophia. So I feel very grateful and privileged to be able to speak to so many different people every day and learn and push myself even more to know, the landscape of this. I'm in a very fortunate position to do that. And obviously all the female friends that I have around me, I'm constantly relaying all this information, and I'm very vulnerable with what I go through and try and have that interaction with my friends. And I actually got a voice note last night from a very good friend of mine where I had sent her to see somebody because she really suffers with PMDD. And it probably took, 8 months of support and convincing to get her to this person that I thought would really help with her hormones. And she sent me a voice note crying last night saying, I don't want to speak too soon. It's been the first month, but it's been life-changing. It's been completely life-changing. And my validation back was, this is amazing, but think how many women are just left feeling like this without the support, because it is something that's not spoken about regularly. And when I was researching this podcast, as well as reading your book and looking at comments at the moment about what women are talking about, I was like, I think I know where I'll go. Reddit. So I went into Reddit and I wanted to see what are women talking about right now when it comes to female health. And I thought I'd share something and see what you think, because it quite broke my heart. It was a young woman shared her experience of getting an IUD. And she talked openly about the pain and the bleeding. So this is what she said. Hi, I got my IUD yesterday. I had to take a day off from my internship to do it and didn't hide the motive. When I got into my internship, a bunch of co-workers, men and women, asked me if it was okay and how it went. I essentially told everyone the same thing. I was in a lot of pain. I bled a lot. And at first I thought I could take it without anesthetic. But then it hurt so much that I had to take it. My other intern friend pulled me aside at my lunch break and she said, I felt like you were being inappropriate towards the male colleagues. She said that talking openly about getting an IUD was going to put the image of me naked in their minds and that saying I bled a lot or was in pain was too much. She said that it was practically like I was harassing them and that I should not share anything to do with women's health or periods with men, and it's uncomfortable for them and for me. She also said that she had been meaning to tell me this for a while because she also felt very annoyed when I openly shared about having menstrual cramps. And this girl ended it with saying, now I'm spiraling a lot. And it's just, that was a really recent Reddit post that I read. And there was 43 lots of comments underneath. And it just made me kind of step back and think for a moment of where we kind of, I guess, disassociated from having these conversations around women's health. And what made me sad about that was it was another woman speaking to another woman in this situation and scenario. Is this something that you see a lot? Is this maybe why that you felt the need to write this book? And you're also incredibly open on your content and social media about your own journey. Like, how do you see the landscape of women's health conversations changing, or do you think they're not?
I think they are. Within like the menopause, we have a lot more conversations about that now. And wasn't always the case. I think people like Davina McCall really paved the way for that. But I do think that anything related to menstrual health and the menstrual cycle is completely lagging behind. And there's still such a taboo shrouded around women's bodies, because I think some people still believe that periods and menstrual cycles should be discussed in hushed tones just for women, hiding your tampon up your sleeve, not having those conversations, not speaking up in school if you're struggling, not taking days off work if you're in really bad pain. And I think the only way that we change that narrative is by normalizing those conversations between men and women, because this is a completely normal bodily function. And no one, when someone shares their pregnancy story, and sometimes there is bodily fluids there, people don't say that, don't talk about that. That's horrible. I guess when I talk about this as well, I get some women say, well, I don't want to talk openly with my male friends or my male partners about my cycle or my period. And that's absolutely fine. I'm not asking you to. But there are some women who are completely struggling in silence and they've got no one to speak to. And actually, by opening up to their partner, they get the support that they need. And we see that even in the research, we see that there is a really interesting study on PMS, premenstrual syndrome, and they did just single therapy with the person that was experiencing PMS, and then they did couples therapy in another arm of the study with the partner of the person who was experiencing PMS. And they found that actually couples therapy was more effective at reducing symptoms. And it's it's kind of like a problem shared is a problem halved. When you include someone in what you're experiencing they can help support you through that, but also it really normalizes it. I think back to my own relationship and at the start of our relationship, maybe our conversations weren't so open around my cycle and my PCOS, but now it's as if we're talking about a headache. It's no different to any other part of my body or any other experience. And he's so equipped to know what to do that I don't feel like I need to really overthink it in my head and really psych myself up to have that conversation. It's so normalized. And for some women, that can be really difficult within their relationship. For some women, they have great partners who are willing to talk about it. So I think it really is taking time to change that narrative. But I think the more we talk openly about it, the more podcasts like this, hopefully more books like mine, will just put menstrual health back on the map like any other part, like mental health, like gut health. It's just another organ.
It is. I think, I believe that not talking about it is silencing the diagnosis of things like PCOS, PMDD, which I think many people even 5 years ago didn't know what that was. People might be listening to this and going, well, what is that? It's kind of the next extreme of PMS, where it's so debilitating for people to cope. Endometriosis, which you just mentioned, even missing periods. I've had sometimes when my friends have mentioned that they've not had a period for 10 months, but they've not really acknowledged it because there's shame there. And so I think having those open conversations is actually really important in this context. And I love that you mentioned PMS, because we had, I don't know if you know her, the neuroscientist, Dr. Sarah McKay, on the show. She was amazing. And it was really blew my mind, because I always come on and go, well, I feel like I know a lot about PMS now, because so many people have come on and spoken about it. And something that she said was, yes, there is so much about the biology and the hormonal side that do affect PMS. But there's also so many other things, like the cultural messages that we're given. And she said in a really interesting stat that in France, 12% of women compared to 90% of women in Iran are affected by PMS. So she's like, wait, is this biological? Is it environmental? Is it cultural? Like, there must be other things. So it makes so much sense when you say, well, if your partner kind of shares the problem and can see you and can support you and can use positive language and not dismiss you and validate you, then it would seem to make more of a supportive environment to be able to cope with PMS.
Yeah, 100%.
So it's interesting. I try and think about how we've all grown up around, like, what are those messages and, like, how were we treated at school? I mean, I remember getting my period at school and I decided that I was sick and wanted to go home. I remember first getting it and going in and pretending that I was really ill to go home because I was so embarrassed.
Yeah. I mean, if no one's prepared you, or maybe you've had like one lesson on it and it was very brief, and, you're an 11-year-old girl who just started her period for the first time, it can be pretty terrifying if you don't have the information that you need. So I'm really not surprised that that was your experience. And I think, my experience wasn't too dissimilar. I have an older sister, so my mum just kind of hushed me into a room with her and she told me what to do, and that was really the only conversation that we had. But I think because I had older sisters, I'd seen them have, hot water bottles. I seen them moan about having painful periods. So I just assumed this is what's coming. Painful periods, sometimes taking time off school, not exercising during that time or not doing PE. I was a really sporty girl, so I found that really, I wasn't really sure how to navigate that. Should I not exercise? Should I exercise? My mum didn't really tell me otherwise. And so I would love that the girls coming up behind us, or even my own daughter, if I ever have one, that their experience is completely different and they feel so well equipped about what to do around their cycles, not just the bleeding phase. And when it comes, it's not like complete panic, and it's not something that's like shrouded in shame or embarrassment, or you can't speak up if you are the girl who's vomiting because your pain is so severe, or you're soaking through your uniform, because a lot of girls do not speak up about that because they're so embarrassed.
Iron is one of the most common deficiencies that I see in clinic, especially in women. And it's not just about feeling tired. Low iron can impact your energy, your focus, your mood, and even your immune system. It's something we really need to be aware of, because if left untreated, iron deficiency can become very serious. Now, UK data shows that around 20 to 35% of women aged 18 to 50 do not need the recommended dietary guidelines for iron intake. And if you're pregnant, menstruating, or following a vegetarian or vegan diet, your needs are even higher, and therefore you're more at risk. So that's why I often recommend Spartone. Now, this is a naturally sourced iron-rich water that comes from the Welsh Hills. It contains ferrous iron, the most absorbable form, with studies showing up to 40% absorption. So your body can actually use what it takes in. Now, it's also incredibly gentle. It's one natural ingredient, there's no harsh tablets, and there's no digestive issues. I use it myself, and it is my go-to in clinic. You can pick up Spartone at Boots, and if you've been feeling low in energy, it's absolutely worth checking in on your iron with your doctor or GP.
That was me. And I think it was really interesting because I know that you try to not talk down about the pill. You have a very balanced view about it. But the solution for me at that time was, we'll just go on the pill because it's so much easier. And then it was great because it stopped my periods. And then I started modeling. So for me, I was like, well, this is brilliant. I haven't got to think about it. And then 10 years later, I had this moment where I was like, wait, I have no idea how my cycle is. And I've had to reframe my own narrative with my menstrual cycle, because now I feel very empowered by it, and I feel very lucky and very grateful to have it. And one of my friends said something really interesting. She said, I kind of feel sorry for men, because we have this amazing moment in a month where we can just allow ourselves to let everything just go, and we can cry and we can kind of reset ourselves.
Yeah.
And she was like, and I feel quite sorry for my partner that he doesn't really get that. He doesn't really get that card in the month. And I was like, that's such a positive way
of looking at it. Yeah.
To look at it. And it takes me back to a question which I get a lot, and I'm sure you get overwhelmed with. But a lot of people will say, well, what does a normal period look like? What is a normal period, and how do I know if I'm not? Because some people say, well, I come on every 21 days. And someone else might say, well, I come on every 34 days. So like, how do we define what a normal period is, and how can we then be aware if we're maybe not falling into the remits of what that could look like?
Yeah. There's no like real such definition of a healthy menstrual cycle, but there are what I like to call green flags, or what fall into that like healthy signs that your cycle's working as it should. And so in terms of how often it's coming, we want something to fall between 21 to 35 days, which is quite a big variation. But textbooks will say like a 28-day cycle is what most women have. But actually, a lot of the research shows that not many women do have a 28-day cycle. So it's okay if you're falling either side of that. Now, another thing that I often find isn't common knowledge is how to track the days of your cycle. So day one is the first day of your bleeding, and the last day of your cycle, so say that is 28, will be the last day before your next bleed. So that's your full cycle length. Then in terms of the bleeding phase, which is typically the first 5 to 7 days, bleeding for 3 to 5 days is considered normal. If you're bleeding up to 7 days and it's quite heavy, that's a bit of a red flag. So you'd want to speak to your doctor about that. But heaviness and pain is very subjective. So we can measure how much fluid or blood is too much to lose. But I don't know about you, but not many people are measuring that. So what I think is a better definition is it's too much for you to manage. So if you're soaking through it every night, if you're having to wear 2 products all the time, if every hour you're like clock watching and you need to like get in and change. And similar with pain, if you're clock watching because you want to stay on top of painkillers every 4 hours because otherwise the pain's too severe, or you're someone who vomits because of the pain, or what I hear a lot of the girls with endometriosis tell me is lying on the floor because it's really cold and that's the only way to get relief when they're, experiencing painful periods or really heavy periods during the night. So they would be red flags. And then not bleeding between your period. Sometimes it's okay to spot. So sometimes after sex you might spot, sometimes after extreme exercise you might spot. But if it's happening all the time, or you're finding it's happening frequently across your cycle, that's also a red flag. So those would be the main things. And the other thing that I'd add in, which we've already kind of talked about, is any severe mood symptoms in that late luteal phase, so the week or so before your period. Anything that's causing disruption in your everyday life, whether that's work, your relationships, your activity, the things that you love, that's a red flag for me.
And so the one thing you mentioned there, which I think every woman will relate to, and if you don't, I'm incredibly jealous. Painful periods.
Yeah.
So you said something earlier, and very similar. I had an older sister and a mum that would always have hot water bottles around that time, and warm baths and, gentle yoga moves. But I always remember being like, oh gosh, and I would be terrified of my period coming because the pain. Is there anything we can do, just thinking actively around having painful periods? Like obviously there's going to be symptoms of maybe why, like endometriosis, like you just mentioned, and other key drivers. But general period pain, like what advice can you give to people who are listening who suffer?
Yeah, it's really tricky if you fall into that category. And most women will experience some pain. it's unrealistic to have no cramping at all, because our body is essentially cramping in order to shed the womb lining. So we have to expect a little bit of discomfort, but severe pain that's interfering with your day-to-day is not normal. If you fall into I get some cramping, but I'm able to carry on with my day-to-day, it's not interfering with like my physical activity or my relationships, then there are a few things that you can do. As much as it feels like an old wives' tale, hot water bottles, heat patches that you can get at the pharmacy, or any heat tool can be effective. And we have some research to back that up. So if you do have a hot water bottle, that's fine, or you can get those heat pads as well. Have a warm bath. They're good methods. Certain yoga poses can be helpful. I've got some in the book.
Hang on, let me find. I've honestly read this back to back, and I remember seeing this and thinking, this is something that I'm definitely going to be doing. Here we go. I'll show it for anyone watching on YouTube. We're going to show you there's different exercises here.
There we go.
How many have we got? 8.
And I've just pulled a few
boat
from.
Pose.
Yeah.
That feels like it would cramp my stomach.
Maybe it would, but this is a sequence that I've taken from a research study. So yeah, and they seem to be the same movements that show up in most of the research studies. But again, no two women are the same. So if you find that uncomfortable, I wouldn't recommend it. There's a lot of people who say, yogis who will say, I've been told not to do inversions during my period. There's actually no evidence to say that you can't. I think maybe hypothetically, some people are worried it might cause something called retrograde menstruation, which is a theory related to endometriosis, but we've got nothing to say that. If it's not causing you any discomfort, you can absolutely do it. It's not harmful. It's more of a ancient recommendation not to do that. So if that's part of your practice and you don't do it for that reason, then don't do it. But if you've always been doing those inversions during your period and it's fine, then continue to do so. But for people who don't practice yoga, all forms of movement can be beneficial during exercise, during your period, because exercise is anti-inflammatory and it can produce antioxidants. So it's really beneficial for us. I know a lot of people don't feel like doing much during that time, but it doesn't have to be severe. It could be a yoga class. It could be going for a long walk. It could be a lightweight session. It could be a Pilates session, whatever works or feels good for you. But generally, trying to move as opposed to complete rest tends to be more beneficial.
I know I've seen you talk about it a lot on the show. We've had Dr. Stacey Sims on here a lot, speaking about the importance of, resistance exercise and training for women's health. But what do you think about training during your menstrual cycle? Because there's a lot of different conversations around this now on, you should ramp it up for the 2 weeks when like pre-ovulation, and then once you've ovulated, you should be slowing it down. Because you're also really into your training. So what do you do, and what does the research say in that kind of sector?
So the research is definitely growing in this space, but there's not a huge amount of studies there on training around the menstrual cycle or recovery around the menstrual cycle or muscle building potential around the menstrual cycle. And of the ones that we have, there is a lot of conflicting evidence or inconclusive results. From the systematic reviews where we pool all the research together, it seems that there may be a small dip in performance during your period. And I think for a lot of people, that is not really a surprise, but it's such a small dip, like very insignificant, that some women won't experience it. The other caveat to that is there's other studies that found otherwise. And when I was writing this book, I really wanted to pull this apart, because I find personally that my cycle really impacts my energy, my motivation to train, and also how strong I feel. And I wanted to find out if that was a real perceived effect, like from objective measures. And there was an interesting study done on athletes. I think they were female footballers, and they perceived that they performed worse during their period. But actually, when they did objective measures of how they performed, their reaction times and other measures were better. So they actually performed better during that time. And I think what this tells us is it's not that it's all in your head that you're having a terrible day or having a hard period, but we can still perform well during our period and during different parts of our cycle. And I found that actually really empowering. At the time I was writing the book, I was doing Paris Marathon and it was day 3 of my cycle. And so having that knowledge in my brain, yes, it might practically be really annoying, but I'm still going to do well. I'm still going to perform well, I think is an important message to tell yourself. So kind of what does the research say? Maybe a small dip around your period and maybe kind of in that late luteal phase. Potentially there's more muscle building potential around ovulation in that kind of like pre-ovulatory phase when estrogen's high, because estrogen is known to really prime us for strength, motivation, endurance training. So you might feel stronger during that time if you do amazing. And there's been a handful of studies, I think 5 now, where they've compared basing most of your training in that follicular phase, so the first part of your cycle, versus the luteal phase, or versus spreading it out across the entire cycle. And they found that maybe there's a benefit of actually front loading your training in the follicular phase. There may be some benefits there. But I think for most women who are not athletes, who kind of are trying to go to the gym around their, working schedule, maybe picking the kids up from school, it's not practical to swap and change their workouts around based on their cycle. And I don't think the benefits are great enough to make that big shift. So I think for most women, use your cycle as a guide, but it shouldn't dictate whether you rest or move. It can't use it to influence how you train in the sense of take each day as it comes. So if you wake up during your period and you feel really uncomfortable, then maybe today's not the day to put a barbell across your hips and do hip thrusts, but maybe doing a mat Pilates class actually feels really good for you. So it's just about taking, I think what the conclusion I've come to is, while we're waiting to gather more research, you are your best piece of evidence. So start tracking your cycles, start feeling how you feel across your training, your cycle and your training program, and see how you need to change things. For me personally, as I said, I feel the effects of my cycle on my training, but I don't follow a cookie cutter approach and say during my luteal phase I only do low intensity exercise. I'm still doing my long runs, I'm still doing my higher intensity speed work and things like that. But if I wake up on a day and I don't feel like I'm up for doing a long run because it's day 1 of my cycle and it's quite heavy, I will just move it to the next day. And it's just about kind of giving your body that grace when it needs it.
I've watched the science of adaptogens grow personally over the last few years, and I've become more curious in their role in nervous system support, focus, and resilience, because adaptogens basically buffer the cortisol that gives us that stress and anxiety. But here's the thing, quality is everything. Most adaptogens on the market don't actually contain enough of the active compounds that you see in clinical studies to make a difference. That's why I've partnered with London Nootropics. These guys only use clinical studied standardized extracts. This is really, really important to get the benefits that you're seeing in clinical research.
And they work with Hephaestus, Europe's leading mushroom bioscience company.
They have high bioavailability. They use incredible ingredients like KSM66, ashwagandha, and rhodola life. And these are the active ingredients that you need to see the difference. They have lots of different blends. Flow gets me into deep focus with lion's mane. Zen helps support my calm and steady my clarity with ashwagandha. And Mojo gives a clean lift, no crash. And Mush Love made with fantastic fungi with 3 Hephaestus mushrooms to elevate your day. Enjoy 20% off and use code LiveWellBeWell. They come in these fantastic little sachets and they are great for traveling too.
I think it's about becoming attuned to your body.
Yeah.
I think we're so many, and I try to not become obsessed with wearables and talk about it as the only inclusion point to have in your data, but it is a great one to be able to see. And I know HRV is kind of, again, a very invariable measure, but allowing yourself to start actually connecting to where you are as opposed to the noise online telling you what you should be, because then you're trying to fit into a cookie cutter that isn't you, and your body might be in a completely different phase. And I think about how many women are listening to this, and hopefully men. It'd be great if men were listening to this episode, but at all different life phases. And if this was Hazel listening to this episode 6 years ago, you'd have had a completely different outlook to where you are today. And I think that's what's really important with women's health and the menstrual cycle. It's about tracking and trusting yourself to know when is the rest and when you can push.
Yeah.
And using that data is really important, as opposed to trying to fit yourself into a puzzle that you think should be working.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think if I think back to when I first stepped into the space and the research space, which was probably about 6 years ago, my perception was everyone needs to understand how training around the menstrual cycle is going to benefit them. And as I've gained more knowledge and more research has come out, my opinion's changed. I don't think that we need to have that cookie cutter approach. And I think that's okay, because things will evolve. But I'm not confident to sit here and say the menstrual cycle has no impact on how we train and perform, because that is just not true for me. And, you mentioned wearables. I find that with my heart rate data, it starts to climb just as my luteal phase comes in, and it climbs. Once my period comes, it drops. And the same with my HRV, it improves and it recovers. And that is a real objective measure for me. And of course, that's going to impact how I train. But also, what the research doesn't always look at is how our symptoms and our psychology impact that. So if you are, I don't know, a footballer and you're wearing white shorts and it's during your period, of course your brain is going to be thinking about, well, I really hope I don't leak right now. Or if you're running a marathon and you have to stop halfway because you need to change your period product, all of those things impact us on some level. So I think it's really important that we continue to have these conversations and help women perform at their best, regardless of what phase of their cycle they're in.
I agree. In so many ways, I think, allowing ourselves to feel more supported in those moments, especially, if you're running a marathon and you're terrified about, well, when's the next loo stop? All of those things play a massive mental load.
Yeah.
So I put some questions out to the audience, which is, I actually don't do very often on this episode, but I knew how important this conversation was going to be. And I'm so aware of my own biases, of like making sure that we're covering everything that people want to hear. So I put one in, but I've actually got my phone next to me, which is very on me during this episode. That's when I am very good. I never have my phone around me during this episode, but I wanted to make sure that we've got the most up-to-date questions. So I'm going to pick a couple.
Okay.
So I've already written one down. So Chloe would love advice for anything around stress and amenorrhea.
Amenorrhea. Yeah, that's a great question. So amenorrhea means you've lost your cycle, and we have primary amenorrhea and secondary. Primary means you never got your cycle. So you maybe had other signs of puberty, but your periods never came, or maybe no signs of puberty came. We won't cover that. We'll assume that she's had a cycle and it's disappeared. So that's secondary amenorrhea. And stress can cause this in severe cases. And so a lot of women actually experienced that during lockdown when we were collecting cycle data. Your cycle maybe just didn't come for a month because worldwide everyone was like, what is going on? And so your body's in this highly stressed state. And the reason that happens is because one of the stress hormones, cortisol, impacts the hormonal axis that influences our cycles. So cortisol basically downregulates the hormones that come from our brain that tell our reproductive organs to produce estrogen and progesterone. So we have this downregulation, and basically it's your body's way of saying it's not safe right now for us to reproduce. We need to turn everything off. Now, that can happen for other reasons, and possibly the most common reason that I see amenorrhea happen within my own practice is extreme exercise and calorie restriction. And the reason why that switches off our signals is because it puts you into a state of low energy availability. So your body doesn't have enough energy after it accounts for exercise to basically give you a healthy cycle. And so it's shifting energy to more important life-sustaining processes like keeping your heart beating and your lungs breathing. And so again, similar thing, it's not safe right now to have a baby. We're going to put you in low power mode like you would in your phone. So everything's a little bit dimmed. You might find your metabolism's a little bit slower. You might find you're a little bit colder. You might find that you're experiencing constipation. Everything's basically slowed right down. And so That's essentially what I see in amenorrhea. And oftentimes it's a combination of things happening. It could be stress, under eating, and over exercising, and how they all interact with one another. And for some women, they will say, you know, I'm doing all of the things. I'm trying to manage my stress. I'm eating more. I'm reducing my exercise. But it can be, sometimes it's unintentional. So you may have started training for a half marathon. You didn't do this before and you didn't realize how much fuel your body needs. Or maybe you've tried to pick up a new exercise routine, but you're doing it fasted in the mornings and it's really long time until you're actually getting your meals. So you're having a long time in this kind of morning deficit. And that can be something that can trigger this, your cycles to become irregular or missing. So there's a couple of things that I would look at. If it's stress related and only stress related, that can be really tricky. But I've rarely seen it where amenorrhea is prolonged for months for just stress, unless you've undergone something hugely significant.
So I would say my interpretation of that would be to work on your parasympathetic nervous system, to work on a lot of somatic work where you're kind of getting into your body, whether that's tapping, yoga, trying to get things to soothe.
Yeah.
And then also looking at how much you're eating, like what is your calorie intake and how extensively are you exercising. I think it can be very hard maybe when you're in that zone to see like how much you might be restricting.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, you know, I'll get someone come to me and they've been working on this themselves for a little while because they've like read the book or they've listened to a podcast. And so they've said, I've been increasing my calories, and then I'll sit down and do a bit of a dietary analysis and realize that yes, they've increased their calories, but they're still restricting carbohydrates. We need carbohydrates to produce hormones as well. And so once we, and I'm thinking of one client in particular, once we addressed the carbohydrate difference and tailored them up, and that took a little while because she had some fear around carbs and kind of hang up from like old diets that she used to do. But once we kind of tweaked that, her cycles became regular and they came back. And actually she was a runner and she found that she was running faster, longer. She was able to, you know, perform better in her everyday life because her hormones are basically like switched back on. So she's like powered back up.
Yeah, I've had that with some of my clients who have come in, and we've even just introduced the beginning of not just having a black coffee, like having food before they train. And it's helped not just with hormones, but it's also helped just with how they felt and how they performed, which is massive. But there's this massive stigma. I mean, it's different for men and women. That's why I think this is so important. I think for women, it's really important to have that in the morning.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do another one. So there's so many here. This might be an interesting one. Does the menstrual cycle affect blood test results, and should this be considered by doctors?
It depends on what blood test results you are doing. If you're just doing a routine blood test result, it shouldn't. But if you are, like what a lot of my clients will do is hormonal blood tests. And so whoever's doing it should be asking what phase of your cycle you're in, because that will dictate how we interpret them. And most people do, but sometimes if you're doing like the in-post at-home blood tests, you know, they don't get that specific, or someone might have forgotten to fill out a box when you were registering it. And then that really means nothing in the grand scheme of things. Like if your progesterone's low, that could mean that you're in your follicular phase and nothing's actually wrong. And so it's important, if you're getting any fertility tests or any hormonal tests, that you are documenting at what day of your cycle you're in. It's trickier if you've got irregular cycles like PCOS, because you may not know. But if you're able to kind of extrapolate based on the data that you have and guess where you should be at, and your doctor can help you do that. But if you're just going in for like a routine renal test or whatever because you're on medication, to my knowledge, it shouldn't matter.
I'm interrupting for one moment to ask one small favor. Please subscribe to the show. This helps it grow more than you know. And I'm so bad at asking this from you. I'm so bad at thinking about this. But you know, my goal is 100,000 to get to on YouTube. And I really want to bring you more content and better guests and bigger episodes. And we can only do that with your help together. So please do hit subscribe. Thank you. Okay. This one I've actually never heard of, so you're going to have to guide me on this pronunciation, but this is from Dion. How to care differently for adenomyosis as opposed to endometriosis.
So adenomyosis is not very commonly known about. Some people call it like endometriosis, like cousin or sister. So endometriosis is essentially where tissue similar to the lining of the womb grows in other parts of the body, typically the pelvis, but it can be in other parts, even the lung. And it responds to the same fluctuations of our menstrual cycle. So you kind of get like it falling away and causing pain at similar times of your menstrual cycle. Adenomyosis is where tissue grows within the muscle wall of the womb. And so pain can be a symptom as well, but heavy periods tend to be a really common symptom. And it's not always picked up. Less is known about it. A lot of the methods are similar in terms of like pain management, hormonal medication, in terms of what we can do. Outside of that, from a lifestyle perspective, there's little to no research on it, but I would assume that following the same principles that I would recommend for endometriosis would be beneficial, because we're looking at something that is hugely inflammatory. So can we bring down inflammation in the body by following an anti-inflammatory diet, gentle movement, optimizing stress and sleep? Supplements would be more case-by-case basis. There's maybe some supplement studies around antioxidants, but you can get lots of that in your diet, colorful fruits and veg, nuts and seeds, citrus fruits, that kind of thing. But I always feel a bit useless when someone comes to me with adenomyosis, because I feel like there's not a huge amount that we know yet. But just supporting your body through those principles is likely to offer some benefit.
It's one of those things, I think, even feeling validated
Yeah.
around it, because I think a lot of it kind of, for me, it mimics similarly to autoimmune diseases. Some people who are diagnosed, or maybe they don't have a specific name, but they just have a lack of energy or lots of pain in their joints or whatever it is, having just the validation that this is something that is, life-changing for someone, I think is actually really important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like for some of these women, especially adenomyosis and endometriosis, it can take a really, really long time to get diagnosed. And some women just give up, or they convince themselves, or they've been brainwashed by someone else that nothing's actually going on and it's just normal. But it's really important that those conditions are diagnosed, because there are treatment options.
Yeah.
And, left untreated, that can impact like things like fertility. So it's important that we're having these conversations early, we're getting support early.
So I think the last one is from Alicia. And this is something actually, it's really interesting that when I saw this just now, I thought, wow, why haven't I asked this question? It's been a lot of conversations off mic, and I've still can't figure out from the research what the answer to this is. So I'm wondering if you might know, which is COVID and cycle problems. So COVID and cycle, or what can be done for mid-cycle spotting?
It's a mixed bag. There's some women noticed that after having COVID, they had different cycle symptoms. They had heavier periods, they had longer periods, or longer cycles. Essentially, they had a different pattern. And that's true of women who had or haven't had this cycle or had the vaccine. So we can't blame it on the vaccine. Now, some women did find changes after the vaccine, but it seems to be more related to COVID as an infection. How it impacts your cycle, we can't say. Some women didn't have any impact, or it resolved after a certain amount of time. If it's impacted you and it's not resolved, and you're having a normal pelvic ultrasound and no other kind of, your blood tests are coming back normal and all investigations, then it's hard to say whether this is your new normal. There's not a huge amount you can do about it. But what I will say is, if your ultrasound was normal, but you're still having symptoms that are debilitating in any way, still push for support, because maybe there's some tests that haven't been done, or maybe there's a diagnosis that's not been explored, because it may very well be COVID, but it could be something else.
And so I want to make sure that I touch on something that's really important, because you've mentioned about endometriosis. And there was a lot of questions in there about endometriosis. So I think maybe to bring them all together, women that are suffering with endometriosis in general, can you explain, what the symptoms could look like, and then how, women can support themselves with a condition that can be very debilitating?
Yeah. So the main symptoms of endometriosis, and they can vary, is painful periods and pelvic pain in general. It doesn't have to just be during your period. It can be across the cycle. It can be around ovulation, but typically painful periods. And that often comes with heavy periods, but not all the time. Depending on where the endometriosis type tissue is growing, that will also influence symptoms. So if you have bowel endometriosis, you will often find that will impact pain when you open your bowels or go for a wee. Pain during sex can be another one. Difficulty with fertility as well is another big issue. They would be the main symptoms. So pain is the primary kind of thing that women are experiencing, but alongside that you can get really debilitating bloating, you can get skin symptoms. As I mentioned, it's hugely inflammatory, so how that impacts your body can be, multifaceted. And fatigue is another really big one as well. And so, like I mentioned, there are lots of medical treatment options. Sometimes surgery is required as well. And outside of that, lifestyle, I kind of touched on it a little bit, but following an anti-inflammatory diet is beneficial. It doesn't have to be extreme. It doesn't have to be restrictive, but we want to get as much color in there as possible. Some women find that who have bowel symptoms, that a low FODMAP diet can help, because there's an overlapping group of women who have endometriosis, also have IBS. But again, I would only do that working with a nutritionist. And the same is for going for a gluten-free diet. Some women find going gluten-free is beneficial. This is based on like one very small study, but saying that in women who have endometriosis, there is slightly higher prevalence of celiac disease as well. So if you think that you don't do well with gluten, or there's a family history, get tested. As you know, going gluten-free is a huge overhaul. It's expensive, it's restrictive. So if you want to make any changes to your diet, work with a nutritionist. Even if you're getting a full dietary overhaul over 1 or 2 sessions, it will just make sure that you're doing it safely.
And also, I think that's just really important for support generally, which is essential. So I think thinking about like everything with women's health in general, if women just feel completely confused, this is something that I feel I hear a lot. I'm just overwhelmed and confused with women's health, like where to start, whether it comes to fertility, whether it comes to trying to understand their symptoms and not feeling like they're a little bit mad. And I hate saying that word, but I think that's how a lot of women have described it to me, whether it's patients or friends. Like, where would you get them to start navigating this journey around it if they feel a lot of shame and stigma as well, and resistance?
I think starting to learn about your body and becoming cycle aware is really important. Get my book.
Obviously.
That will be beneficial. And if you're at the point in your life where you are having cycles, getting to understand your cycles, regardless of whether you're having debilitating symptoms or not, will hugely benefit you. Because even if you're not having symptoms, but you've noticed that your cycle length is getting longer and longer, and you're thinking about kids in the next 1 or 2 years, you really want to get a handle of what's happening in your body. So I think there's so much to gain from just learning about your hormones and your cycles, regardless of who you are and what symptoms you're experiencing, if at all. If you're approaching like other parts of your life, like perimenopause and menopause, starting to think about what that means for you. I actually don't cover it in this book, but I cover it in my last book called The Female Factor, about what to expect during those different life phases. Because again, your hormones shift again. You don't have that lovely menstrual cycle. You have really erratic hormones for a little while, and then you have kind of really flat hormones. And that lack of estrogen is going to impact things like your brain health, your bone health, your heart health. And what you do now will proactively prevent you from experiencing problems in the future. So it's really about becoming more aware about how your hormones impact you. And that includes fertility as well. I'm not a big believer that we need to all go through these big fertility MOTs and figure out like what X, Y, and Z is doing. If you're worried about your fertility, yes, but do it with a doctor, do it with someone who's qualified, because what I often find is women who've done like these postal tests, it said maybe you have PCOS or maybe your AMH is low, your egg quality or egg levels are low, and then they're panicking, but they've got no one to tell them what that legitimately means. Do it with someone who can counsel you on what next steps would be.
I think fertility is a really important thing. We've had quite a few people come in here talking about fertility. And I think for women, there's more options than ever before.
Yeah.
But I think it's confusing. It's obviously very expensive. But I also think it's scary for a lot of women to kind of take that step into exploring it. Because in a way, when you take that step, you actually get the data and you know where you are. And some people are a bit scared about figuring out, knowing where they are, because if it's not the answer that they want, then there does feel like a panic. So you've navigated that area personally, publicly. How do you feel about having those conversations and going to a clinic to get checked to see where you are?
Yeah, I personally, around my PCOS diagnosis, and I decided to get my AMH tested, which is kind of like a crude measure of like egg number. And mine was really low, which is not typical of PCOS. You usually get like quite high numbers. And mine was very, very low. So the consultant that I'd seen said, if you're not looking at having kids in the next 3 years, I would freeze your eggs now. And so I did. And I was only at the start of my relationship with the person that I'm actually going to marry in 2 months' time, but I didn't know that at the time.
Yeah.
And I also wanted this to be my decision. So I decided to freeze my eggs, not embryos, just in case our relationship didn't work out. And I'll be honest with you, like, it is a hugely costly process. So I was privileged that I could afford it, but also I was able to take off time around that. But even as someone who was medically qualified, I just found the whole process, like, I learned a lot from it. There was a lot I didn't expect in terms of how much admin goes into taking injections at the same time every day. Just even the egg collection process, the data around it also isn't great. Like, you know, even when you do get eggs, how many of them are mature? How many of them are suitable for freezing? How much does that mean? Like, nothing's a guarantee. Even when you have the eggs, nothing's a guarantee. And so I wish I had more information before I went into it, but I'm also really glad I did do it. So now when I speak to women, I think if you are in your, early 30s and you're not ready to have kids, but you know it's something that you want, explore your options. That's absolutely fine. But also, one bad result doesn't mean everything's terrible. So taking one result like an AMH doesn't take everything else into account. And I have friends who have amazing AMHs, amazing hormone levels, perfect cycles their entire life, and still struggle to get pregnant. And then I have friends who froze their eggs because of the same situation as me, and they got pregnant naturally on the first try. So you just don't know. And what I don't want women to do is do one test and panic and think that it's all doom and gloom for them. I think it's worth having a conversation.
It's 100%, because I didn't talk about it publicly, but I went through egg freezing last year. And it was really hard because I came out of a very big relationship that was quite traumatizing. And I remember all I had in my brain was, I have to do this. But the pressure of it was so much.
Yeah.
And it was interesting that I went through the process with the person I was with originally, and then ended up not going through with it, and then became single and went through with it later. But when I went through it the first time, we did go to a good clinic, but not one that I would recommend. And they delivered these results in a really cold way and made me panic and gave me really, I would guess, not empathetic advice, and showed me numbers and made me feel like I was going to have a real problem to get pregnant, which obviously sent me spiraling. And then I became single, which sent me spiraling even more. And then 6 months later, when I went back into a different clinic, a very small one with a woman who was very empathetic and held my hands through the whole process, and actually was like, actually, everything's great. Actually, I would love, I'd love to have this as a textbook. And it was the difference of how she spoke to me and how she made me feel. The journey was a completely different journey, and I felt completely empowered by the end of it. I have to say, like, when I finished the last injections and had the egg retrieval, that's when I felt low.
Yeah.
It was the dip afterwards, where I was like really emotional. It was obviously all the loss of hormones. I found it really hard.
I was the same.
Yeah. And everyone I then spoke to, I had a couple of friends that I called and they all said I was the same.
Yeah, but no one prepares you for that.
No one prepares you.
And I mean, I didn't even think about that. But
No.
they say, oh yeah, take one day off work. But then it's the days after where you feel so low.
So low.
And maybe just like experiencing discomfort. So if I have any clients going through it, I say like schedule it for a Friday and take the entire weekend off. Don't see anyone, rest, get good food in, plan like a marathon of Netflix and just rest.
Yeah.
Because I think one day is not enough.
I agree. And I think it is that thing of, I was lucky that I was very knowledgeable when I went in because my therapist was trained in this as well. So I managed to have her support me on that journey, which I think is really important because I felt that I managed to create a bit of a team. But it took me about a year to make that decision. It wasn't an overnight thing. And I do think that, as you said, there's no guarantee. Like, even if you get mature eggs and even if they're frozen, the next stage on the defrosting might not be that successful. You might not create an embryo and that embryo might not turn into a baby.
Yeah.
And so it's all of that like understanding of the process, because it is an emotional process, I think, to go through for many women.
That's it. And I think what I would say is like, don't compare yourself to like people you see on forums or online. And when I was going through the process, while I documented my journey, I didn't share numbers because I just felt like it became a numbers game. And even when I got my numbers, felt like, oh, well, maybe I should have got more, or, they were encouraging me to do more cycles. And I just thought, I'm good. I'm going to stick with what I have, and what will be, will be.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing. I did write an article about it recently for the first time, and it was a really hard decision to do. But I know that I've now done everything I can.
Yeah.
And what will be, will be. And I think that's one of the things that I feel very grateful for, to be in this generation, to have an option, to be able to explore it. But I really don't think it is for everyone. And so now I think we're talking about this of, just freeze your eggs. And it's such an emotional journey. So I think, just having these conversations is important, and to reduce the stigma. So I guess like bringing this all together, and I love that we did touch upon fertility to end it, because I did start in saying it's not just about fertility, but it's part of the journey. It's part of something that women who are career driven, or not even career driven, just all women in their 30s get to this point where they're like navigating. But your period is basically part of your life since you become a teenager. It's the first step into womanhood, really.
Yeah.
And so it is with you for your whole life. And I do think it's so important for us to connect to this so much more and try to feel empowered by it and grateful. What's the one thing that you want people to leave today's conversation with who've listened? What do you want them to maybe share or send to a friend? What is the one thing that you want women to feel connected to?
I think that it's not just a period. Like, there's so much more happening in your body. Every single day you are essentially experiencing a different hormonal profile, and that impacts every single level of what's happening in your body, how you sleep, how you move, your cravings. And really understanding that is so empowering. I think it can just really help to improve like your quality of life, your overall health, your experience of your cycle, and also your appreciation for your body. So start to learn more about your cycle outside of just the period.
And lastly, which is my question, which I ask all my guests, which is, what does live well, be well, Hazel, mean to you?
I think living well to support a really fruitful life.
Oh, I love the word that you use, fruitful. It had nutrition in there at the same time. I love that. That should be my answer as a nutritionist. Yeah, I love that. I mean, fruitful and joyful. I think sometimes we can forget that part.
Yeah, that's the point. It's the whole point.
The whole point. Thank you so much for, all the work that you do for women's health. It's commendable. And please don't ever regret the time of leaving the NHS to come and do all the incredible work that you're doing, because you're just helping so many people.
Thank you.
And it's a different way of doing things, but it's a bigger reach. And you're so dedicated and you're so committed that I just hope that you take some time for yourself.
Thank you.
So thank you for coming.
Thanks for
on.
having me.